Welcome everybody to today's version of Reality Change with Kris. We are going to invite Kris to join us shortly, but we just want to get some introductions out of the way. I'm John Hawkins, and this is my friend Serge Granbois.
And I'm Serge, and this is my friend John.
Can't
leave you out.
Hey?
Can't leave you out.
No. And Kris, we'll ask Kris to join us shortly. Basically, I normally take a moment and talk a little bit about the last show, but I can't remember a thing. That's not really quite true. But there was a wonderful discussion. What was the name of the living biological... what was the name of the last show? Living Biological Mechanism or something like that? No, poetry. Living Biological Poetry was the phrase that caught my attention in that last show.
Sounds like a very fancy thing.
Well, that's who we are. I like the idea of poetry. I mean, so often when Kris talks about the situation, material reality, the stuff that happens behind the scenes, he talks about it in frankly poetic terms, as something exquisitely beautiful, like an orchestra or so, you know, I guess we're going to have to get used to the idea that we're living biological poetry.
Yeah, he has a few things to say on that.
So I guess we should invite Kris to join us and see what direction he wants to go today.
Now we trust that you are comfortable.
Thank you.
And we thank you for your consideration.
Thank you for yours.
Yes, indeed. Very nice, evocative title, is it not? Living Biological Poetry.
Yes.
If truth must be known, you can, and perhaps even should consider the whole of material creation, which includes more than what your senses detect at any given moment, truly is poetic creation of unbelievable magnitude. Your poets from time immemorial can tap into an notion only. Let's say the esters of this magnificent poetry.
Esters?
Indeed.
All right.
And in this way, they make concerted efforts to bring about this kind of inspiration, creating muses that allow them to draw from this vast, incredibly sophisticated poetic endeavor, and they give it some words, interpret it in their vision, and give it words. Just like yourselves, though instead of words, you use objects. You objectify this subjective poetic flow. And you create in this way the objects that you interact with. You do not necessarily create the people that you encounter because they are their own poetic productions, their own beautiful endeavors or interpretations. But the interactions are your own, and what you take from it is your own. So each of you, in some unbelievable fashion, are poets and philosophers. Philosophers are also poets in their own way. But if you look at it from that perspective, whether it is a mathematician, a researcher, film producer, everything in their experience is a poetic interpretation of those deeper subjective states that they experience at those particular levels. Whether it is a cook, a chef, a mother, a father, whatever your particular natures are, you are all beautiful and artistic poets in that way. You give your interpretations through the actions and the dramas that you go through on a daily basis. You often get caught up in the angst of your own poetic renditions. You act out according to the beliefs that you entertain, your perceptions. But these can all be changed. They can be altered, modified in a manner that proves more beneficial for the individual. Now this may lead into the very idea of what is reality change? What is reality creation? And there are many, many different points of view on the subject matter, of course. The basic notion is that you have within you, the individual has within himself or herself, the capacity to alter or change the experience of his or her life. Now that is very basic. Some may take a tangent on it and say, yes, well, you can also change everything else. That the sky is the limit and beyond. Everything is possible. It is very nice to hear these things, but in actuality they are very different concepts. When any individual encounters a situation that proves to himself or herself to be challenging in the utmost, even problematic, creating a cascading effects of struggles, angst, and so many other situations. It is very, very important to know that this is not something you are fated to live through, as if somehow or other you are predestined to endure difficulties. The only thing that you are truly predestined in any way, shape or form is to discover your abilities to make edits to your own internal programming. And in order to accomplish this very nicely, one has to also come to terms with the very reasons you maintain the situation, because there may be benefits, however subtle they may appear. So the idea that one can make changes to his or her situation, as we have pointed out in previous discussions, is very ancient indeed. It has been with your species since the very beginning of your species. In fact, it existed before there was a beginning. Because the beginning of what you call the beginning is just that, an interpretation of that concept or notion. Does it make sense to you?
Well, it's getting a little back and forth there for sure. But I think I understand what you're saying, and that is that the impulse or the mechanism, the ability to edit our experience is primordial.
Indeed. It has been, in fact, it was before you were, so to speak. In fact, the fact that you are is a testament to that notion.
Because I got edited to be this.
You basically desired yourself into being.
Okay, that's a very interesting. I desired myself into being. Well, who would it be that desired it if it wasn't the being?
You always are. Do keep in mind that you who makes the desires is not the one that is sitting here in the chair. That is, in the most beautiful way and poetic interpretation of that being's desire.
Do you know, this reminds me of something you said about 3 shows ago, which was that you could think of us as being, and this is poetry again, you could think of us as being a metaphor of soul.
Indeed. And what are metaphors but a different kind of poetry?
Exactly.
So metaphorically / metaphysically speaking,
Okay.
whom and what you are is very different than what you think you are. The majority of individuals go through their lives without any value judgments on this at all. But the majority of individuals go through their lives fully convinced that they are nothing more than the result or the production of genetics and a particular evolutionary process in the scientific terms that it is understood today. In other words, that your ancestors might have been baboons. No offense to any baboon, please.
Right, and before that, we were lightning struck a swamp or something, and there was an oily little bit, and then out of that came life. This is a fairy tale.
Truth be known, they are all fairy tales.
Right.
It is difficult for many to even come close to accepting the idea that even the scientific interpretation of how things came to be and how things are is itself a myth, another metaphor to try and explain the thing of things.
Right, the isness of being.
Indeed. So this, as you say, the isness of being, still escapes many individuals. But when an individual accepts a particular definition and becomes convinced that this is how they came to be, it may be difficult to examine other prospects in terms of the philosophy behind it. The philosophy behind the modern versions of the isness of being is that ultimately there was nothing in the beginning and there will be nothing at the end. Everything that happens in between is purely impulsive biological instinct for the sake of its own self. Do you follow that?
Yeah, you're not describing what is, you're describing what the scientists think.
Indeed.
Oh, okay, good. Because I was getting a lot of nothingness there.
So the idea that perhaps it is all for nothing in itself has its own flaws. Just as some may say, yes, but the religious versions may have their own flaws as well. But neither camp can see eye to eye. Because, of course, one's camp eye is different from the other's camp eye.
Right. Different perceptions, different beliefs.
Indeed. And there are times when there are simply irreconcilable differences. They simply cannot come together. Though many attempts have been made. Sometimes one system of beliefs simply eradicates another system of belief, therefore eliminating any competing ideology.
Right.
In your own recent human history, many religions have attempted to do just that. Anything and anyone, any group, any nation that may have thought differently was immediately seen as the enemy, the other. Therefore, gather your arms, pick up your swords, and eliminate. You have seen this with the Christian churches. You have seen this with Muslim denominations. You have seen this with other groups over and over.
Right.
When particular religious structures become so intensely polarized and therefore generate extremist revolutionaries, then you have great difficulties. So these particular waves may go about sowing their carnage, only to realize that in the long run they would have to eliminate simply everyone, even their own kind. Because eventually no two individuals can truly think and believe alike.
That's the glory of being an individual.
Indeed. So the isness of being does attempt to celebrate that particular individuality. When this takes root, and others can also be respected for their own views without any particular fears, then you have the development of situations that are most agreeable. Another kind of poetry in motion.
Yeah, even the thing that's coming to me to understand better and better with the various materials you've presented is that even the things, even when people are fighting, even when people are eradicating the enemies and, whatever it is, that's still poetry.
It is simply rather motivated poetry.
Yeah, it's, there's some poetry that I don't like very much. And then there's other poetry that just really lifts me up. So, the point for me is I don't have to read the poetry I don't like. Nobody's forcing you. And when I say poetry, I'm saying beliefs and perceptions. Some of them are just not to my taste. And it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing.
Indeed. Now that we are talking about the thing of things again,
Sorry about that.
it is always important to know and eventually appreciate that your particular individual expressions of poetry are just as relevant and sacred as somebody else's. Now, this does not give any particular group the right to then eliminate other groups' own poetry and individuality. But this is something, a process that you as a species have to come to terms with and recognize that every individual's uniqueness is a cause of celebration. All of life can easily be recognized as something quite sacred in this way, without getting into any religious perceptions here. But every individual has that graceful sacredness through which they express their poetry. Mm-hmm. And it is done automatically. There is an aspect of the self that more or less meets out all of these needs to generate the expressions necessary, the poetry. Just like you have a publisher, a poet has a publisher that publishes his or her works.
Right.
So there is that aspect of self that more or less publishes your poetry. It organizes all the necessary energies to allow for the demonstration, the public sharing demonstration of your, his, hers, hers, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Each of you have this unique and particular trait. And it is not limited to just the one incarnation. This particular aspect travels from particular incarnation to incarnation to incarnation, assuring that the needs of the individual, the soul, are met in different incarnations.
So again, this is another case where what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak, is completely automatic for our benefit. For instance, I'm just going to ask you a question that may, reflect on the foundations of what the show is about. But if we just relax all the things that we're grasping to ourselves, if we just relax into the isness of our own being, do we have to worry about changing beliefs? Do we have to worry about perceptions and making things, or is it just automatic?
When your species gets to the, we will call it evolutionary stage,
Right.
where you can naturally dispense with the acquisition of limiting, restrictive belief structures and not be influenced by them, then you will be in that position to actually relax into the flow of the thing.
Yeah, that sounds lovely.
Very nicely.
Yeah.
And you will notice that there are sometimes moments during the day where you can catch yourself actually enjoying that flow. We mentioned some of this on Monday night.
Right.
When you have been happy throughout the day and you notice suddenly that it is time to go home. Where has the day gone?
Time flies when you're having fun.
Indeed. Now another individual may say the very same thing. Where has the day gone? I have been swamped with problems and challenges all day. And I did not see anything. Simply a shift in perception. That is all that is required.
Well, I like the idea, which I think you're describing, that at a certain point, once we get over the hump of letting go of the limiting beliefs and not being attracted to them anymore, I guess that has to do with desire, then we can just relax into the flow, and we don't have to do all this fussing about, you know, recalibrating everything all the time. I mean, if it's automatic, let's just let it be automatic.
Now, of course, you do understand that your species is not one to take lightly to being bored. So you will create challenges to yourself.
Sure, okay, I get that. I see that in my own life, for sure.
Indeed. It's not that one necessarily goes out of his way to create drama. But when you need to challenge yourselves and your very basic, natural spiritual instincts, you may generate situations that cause you to reflect, to internalize the process, basically go into the subjective state and recognize what you are setting up so that you can make the changes necessary. Do you remember when perhaps you were young and watching television? There used to be a children's show called The Friendly Giant.
Oh, yes.
With Rusty the rooster and Jerome the giraffe.
Yes.
And the giant, every day, he would take his little chairs and little table and move them around to accommodate the company that is coming.
Yes.
This might not be familiar to those outside of America and Canada.
Or who are perhaps a little younger than I am.
Indeed. But there is the ever fascinating YouTube.
Sure.
Now, we present this perhaps as a crude analogy, but you have your own mental furnitures, which are all various types of beliefs. They all exist in your own subjective experience. And you move them around, just like the giant would move his little tables and chairs, and so on and so forth. So you have all of this mental belief furniture, if you like.
Right.
And you have them in a very specific way, in a very specific place.
And you arrange it in order to have certain
Indeed.
outcomes, experiences.
Indeed. And if someone came in and moved all that furniture around without telling you,
Imagine.
and the lights were out at the same time, indeed, you would stop that too.
But other people can't move my furniture.
That is correct. Now, you sometimes make attempts to move that furniture. You meaning any individual.
Right.
To move that furniture, and you feel that momentary bizarre feeling, as if somehow or other you ended up combing your hair the other way this morning.
Right.
Feels very surreal, unrealistic, unnatural.
It's like crossing your arms the wrong way.
Indeed. So you look at this internal belief furniture and you are loath to touch it because you are convinced this is the way the things are. One cannot begin tinkering under the hood because who knows what will happen. However, if you do take that poetic license
Nice.
and go into your internal house where all of this nice furniture is already established and you have all of the walls filled with the knickknacks that you want and all the decorations, these are all parts of your belief systems. And then you can begin to take them down if they have served their usefulness. You may consider them trophies or not, or perhaps as something to give away, bring out of the home. There are many, many different things that you can do with this particular kind of imagery. then you can make new arrangements. You can put your furnishings in a different way. You give the room, metaphorically speaking, a whole new atmosphere. Again, metaphorically speaking, you all have this ability. You all have this innate knowledge, but you do not use it. And the less you use it, the more you forget about it. So it is about change. And you often find yourselves as a species in a conundrum, because you generally do not like change. Even those who make great proclamations about how change does not necessarily upset them in any way, shape or form may have their particular pet peeves along some ways. But the thing with this is that you have this resistance to change, and at the same time it is through change that you prosper as a personality and that your individuality shines forth.
Well, that's a bit of a conundrum, as you say.
Indeed. So you find yourselves in this quandary, and yet it is only through the process of accepting that fears and resistances seem to dissolve. Often after the fact, you may scratch your head and wonder why you were ever so fearful of changing the situation.
You know, I'm in a quandary right now. I do not want to interrupt you, but...
You need a break.
Yes.
Indeed, then, it is acceptable.
Thank you. We're back. And what an interesting show we're having, talking about poetry and giants moving furniture. It's a really interesting show. But before we get back to Kris, I think we've got one or two just brief announcements. That we're going to do another show at Origo Books.
Yes.
Next month, early next month, 7th?
I think it's on the 7th of November.
Yeah.
I hope I don't forget. But if anybody is interested, they can always go to origobooks.com and look at the
Check it out.
schedules and for the speakers. And
Do you know the topic?
I think it's called The Missing Link.
The Missing Link. Oh, that sounds interesting. Yeah. Okay, and the other thing I just wanted to remind everybody, in case you didn't notice, and that is we have a complete channel on YouTube dedicated to this show. The channel is called Reality Change with Kris. And all our shows are up there. We've got 6 of them so far. And this show will be up there as well in due course. So if you're interested in getting an update in your email, all you have to do is subscribe to that channel and turn on notifications. And every time we upload a show, you'll get an email saying, there's a new show to watch.
And I'd also like to, I think we did it last week, but it might be worth mentioning again, to thank our
our
sponsor,
new sponsor,
Barbara.
yes.
And thank you very much for that. And I don't think there's any other announcements for the time being.
Well, okay, so let's see if we can't get back to talking about...
Well, maybe just not tonight, but next Wednesday night
Yes.
is an international session for welcoming new individuals, new people who want to interact with Kris at that level with Skype. So you can look it up on the website at
Lotus-Mind.ca.
yes, and look for international sessions and take it from there.
Okay, I recommend the international sessions, folks, because I attended them for years and years, and the great thing about them is you get to ask questions. Typically, Kris doesn't come in with an agenda, and he throws it open to questions. And I have, so if you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer here, then the international session is great. Also, for people who really want an in-depth understanding of their situation, you can buy a personal session, an hour-long Skype session with Kris, which you get a recording of it, and again, that's potentially a life-changing experience.
Yeah, and many people will have commented in the past that as Kris is answering, let's say, one of their questions, that he seems to also be able to anticipate other inquiries and answer them as well, which is very interesting.
Well, if I was going to let anybody move the furniture in my mind around, it would be Kris. I'm kidding. That's not an invitation.
Okay, so let's get into the swing of it.
All right. Welcome back, Kris.
Indeed. And how is your poetry this day?
The poetry is working good for me. You gave us an exercise, actually, associated with, I'm not sure if you talked about it in this show, but you gave us the exercise of being the observer of our lives a while back, and I find that to be a wonderfully poetic thing to do, is to just observe without judgment the play of life as it flows. And the interesting thing that I'm finding as I apply that exercise again and again is, even though I'm looking out at the world, it turns out that what I'm observing is myself, and how I respond and how I interact and how I, my perceptions. That's really what I'm observing.
Perhaps we can spend a few moments on that very subject, about observing life. Some people may have some difficulties in understanding how one does that. So you can, for example, remember those times when you are at the theater. Whether it is a film or a live play, a traditional theater. You are sitting in the audience. You are part of the audience. You are observing what is occurring on the stage or on the screen. That is how you can examine some passages or some segments of your life. And that may often only occur in retrospect, but that is also very nice and quite significant. Not everyone may think of observing a situation while they are knee-deep in it.
Oh, that's interesting. So we can look at it later.
Indeed.
As though we're in a movie theater, and the incident that we didn't observe when it happened is we're now observing it on the movie screen.
Indeed. It would be most beneficial if, for instance, you're driving. It would not be recommended to go into observer mode whilst you are driving.
You want to be right there.
Indeed. You need to be consciously present to your senses. So you can always return to that memory, and perhaps the right word would be to, how do we say? perhaps neutralize or eliminate any adverse effects from an interaction, whether it is with another individual or a situation or an encounter or so on and so forth. You no longer have to let that situation influence you adversely.
Well, that's very
Notice, however, that no one makes any edits, quote unquote, modifications or changes to situations that are beneficial.
No, that's true.
You do not decide that today I will make changes to a nice event that occurred yesterday and I will tremendously screw it up. No one ventures there.
No. And if you're having a great time, you don't say, oh, I think I'm going to change my reality now.
Indeed. You like to continue enjoying what is enjoyable. That is part of your innate self. Your nature is structured such that anything pleasurable, joyful, is what draws you the most. Even when there are some situations that seem to contradict that. Challenges of one kind may also be attractive because it presents stimulus.
Right.
And intensely so at that. Pits you against the very basic nature of your beliefs in such a way that you have the opportunity to then reflect and make necessary changes or alterations.
That's interesting because I know there's a certain type of person who you were mentioning earlier, we don't like boredom, and I hear you, but there's a certain type of person, and this is not judgmental. Okay, it's judgmental. And that is that they want to have a certain amount of drama in their lives. And if things go smoothly for 2 or 3 days or a week, then just observing, you can see them create the drama because they like living life at a high, in a high emotional
They
state.
need that high octane
Yeah,
experience. The rush of adrenaline.
yeah,
The seemingly being pitted against an opponent or enemy even. Something that gets the blood to rush. Because it is empowering for such an individual. Even if they are the perception that they are the victim.
all right.
And to rail against the oppressor may still be beneficial.
A certain satisfaction in railing really nicely.
Indeed. Therefore, earlier on we mentioned that there are some who have benefits from situations that to others may appear most ridiculous. But still the benefits warrant the pursuit of that experience. So there are all manner of individuals in this way. It creates the diversification of your race, your genetic pool, and everything pertinent to such an experience. Do you follow?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it takes all kinds to make the thing complete.
Indeed. For what would an oppressor be without the oppressed? And what would the oppressed be without the oppressor? So these are particular dramas, and there are countless variations on the themes that are valid expressions. The point being that when you realize and need to have changes in your life, then you are able to because the mechanisms are available. And they have been with your species for thousands and thousands of years as to how you can change those situations. That is what is called reality change. It is not some hocus pocus or some kind of stardust we are selling.
Okay.
Because it is not from us, it is from you. You have the abilities and the capabilities to make the necessary changes in your life so that that life resonates more with your innate nature. in that you are Satchit Ananda. You are blissful, full of knowledge, and you are eternal. That is your most primal nature. Everything else is conditioned. So you can acquire the knowledge to live out your life in a more enjoyable and blissful manner, because that is your eternal nature.
So more congruent with who you really are.
Indeed. Now that is the self. This is the you that is you.
Right, not this.
The physical body is a very nice construction, and it too is, you could say, genetically woven poetry in action.
Okay. Poetry in action.
Indeed. It is generated through your DNA, your blood cells, your tissues, and so on and so forth. It too then belongs in the realm of poetic expressions.
Living biological poetry.
Indeed.
Well, that's great. That's a happy thing to think about. I mean, once I understood that I wasn't my body, which, is an evolving process, of course, there was a feeling of, I'm soul and the body is material. And there was, without my intending it, there was kind of a judgment there, which is, okay, I'm soul, that's good. And here's the material body, and that's, we make the best of a bad bargain, right? So the idea that it's, what did you say? It's poetic.
Genetically interwoven poetry.
I like that very much. That helps me locate it in an honorable place, even though it's not who I am.
Indeed. For instance, you are accustomed to reading printed poetry. It might be even a stretch of the imagination to think of poetry in other terms. But if you allow the imagination to be stretched in those directions, and consider that instead of printed words, you have biological matter that is forming itself into your bodies according to the rules of consciousness.
As opposed to the rules of grammar.
Indeed. So instead of printed words, you have genetic material that stitches itself into the body. You grow this body, and it is filled again with that poetry from the self. And everything that sustains that body is also a poetic expression. Just maintaining that point of view, even for a small amount of time, can leave an impression upon your consciousness and in your brain in such a way that you might be tempted to have a different perception of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the whole point of this reality change business. Do you understand?
We're editing poetry.
Indeed, you are constantly doing it. But sometimes your species feels as if you are stuck in a particularly unsavory poem, and what can you do about it?
Right.
Now you know you can do something about it.
Now, here's an interesting thing to think about, too, from that perspective, and that is, you were saying earlier that the self is like the publisher, and the poetry would be my desires and
All of the beliefs and everything that you
right.
generate.
And so this then is the published poetry. But I like this analogy, metaphor. when you're editing poetry, you don't go to the published book and start changing the words in it. You'd have to find all the books, right, and change all the words. No, you go to your original manuscript, you change that, and then you have it republished.
And you do not have to waste any whiteout.
Right. Yeah, well, it's basically impossible to find all the books, all the published books, but you change the manuscript and republish.
And the nice thing is you do not have to republish. By making the edits, all of the books that are printed are automatically upgraded.
Okay, that's getting spooky.
Because that is your power. That is what reality change is all about.
You don't have to change the books. They automatically change themselves.
They are updated. Just like your beautiful electronic devices can automatically receive upgrades,
Right.
and then the operating system or the applications function anew.
What a lovely thought. That's a wonderful perspective.
It is not ours, it is yours. Where simply point out some things that you might not have seen, sometimes like not being able to see the trees for the forest.
Right.
And with that, we thank you for a most poetic hour, and we return Joseph to you.
Thank you, Kris, for a lovely hour. Well, folks, thank you very much for watching. Honestly, I'm a little bit blown away by some of the material that Kris just presented. I love the idea that those books update themselves automatically. Woo! Anyway, we're going to do this another week from now. And in the meantime, enjoy the poetry of your own life.